Hello and welcome to Rick's RC Flying channel. Uh, this video, the format's a little differently with respect to what I normally talk about on the channel, and it's a result of a lot of emails and inquiries that I have gotten in the past year about my fellow modelers and other aviators curious on my professional background as a full-scale pilot. And it's many times if they've asked questions related to flying full-scale airplanes, whether it was techniques or some of the experiences I had. And quite a few over time have expressed that it would be possibly worthwhile, first of all, to give a bit of a bio on my background and open up the channel a bit to another side to aviation related to whether it's techniques or experiences or what have you. So I thought I would entertain that, or at least try it out and see what you fellow modeler viewers or full-scale pilots may want to try. So here's just I'll try to make it as brief as possible because I've been involved in full-scale aviation for over 50 years. I started flying when I was 15 years old. And, you know, I did my private, commercial, multi-engine instrument, became an instructor at a rather young age, and I did that for thousands of hours. And then eventually I did charters. I got an airline transport license. Matter of fact, I had to wait a year to get that license because I was too young. I had everything I needed. I wrote all the exams. I did all that. And I had to wait till I was 21. And then on my birthday, I actually went in and asked for the license. And so I did charter flying in light twin engine type aircraft. Actually, one that comes to mind, I flew an Aerostar. It was all single pilot IFR for about 1,000 hours in 1 year alone. And most of it all done at night. Back in the day, we used to fly canceled banking checks and things like that. So I did that kind of flying when I was young. I did instructing as well, and instrument training and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually I went to a company in Newfoundland and ended up their chief pilot for their IFR division, where we had air ambulance and did charter flying all along the Labrador coast and within Newfoundland and occasionally to the mainland, St. Pierre and Miquelon Islands. And so I did that. And from there, I went to an airline called Nordair. And there I was hired on as a second officer on the DC-8. And which was a tremendous experience. We flew that all over Europe and North America, like down to the Caribbean. And actually, even in the Middle East, we used to fly between Tripoli, Libya, to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, back and forth. So it was very, very interesting flying. And from there, I went on an airplane called a Lockheed Electra. Now, this airplane, we had two of them, and they were specially designed and modified to do reconnaissance work, and specifically was for ice patrol. We literally mapped all the ice in the Arctic, like the Beaufort Sea and all up through Ellesmere Islands and all down there right to the eastern seaboard. Matter of fact, even ended up in Thule with the airplane. So we would patrol. I mean, the best way to describe the inside of that airplane looked like a submarine. We had a designated team of meteorologists and scientists and who specialized in ice. And they had specialized radar systems, thermal sensors. They could tell you the temperature of the water, the thickness of the ice, the type of ice. It was incredible. I didn't know there were so many different kinds of ice. And so they would, collect all this information and create maps and charts and data. Quite often that information would be sent to the Coast Guard icebreakers and other ships that needed to know where the icebergs were and the ice flows and how thick they were. It was very, very, very interesting. Crew wise, we had a navigator uh, who was a real specialist. We used to go on long patrols. They could be 8, 10, 12, 15-hour patrols. I mean, the airplane carried an incredible amount of fuel. It was all modified for that. Uh, Geez, I think it was capable of flying 20 hours. It was just amazing. And we used to patrol at 180 knots. So that's rather slow for that airplane, but that was a requirement in the patrolling operation. And sometimes, depending on the weather, we would actually patrol as low as 500 feet above the water and do that for hours. And normally we would do it at 1,000 feet or sometimes as high as 3,000. There were factors that would dictate what we would do. Also, one of the airplanes had a radar system called a SLAR radar, which really helped out in that regard. And I did that for quite a while. And from there, I went on to a Fairchild 227 and ended up flying to all the dew line sites up in the Arctic. So, basically the dew line sites covered from Alaska all the way up to, Cape Dyer. And we had sort of what we call the Western Arctic and the Eastern Arctic. And so we had two bases, Cambridge Bay in the Northwest Territories and Hall Beach. Um, that whole operation was generally speaking all gravel runways and short runways. And the Arctic is a very hostile environment. I mean, there are times, as most of you are aware, that it's just continuously black. There's no daylight. You get into these dark periods, and we used to do 2-week tours. So you'd be flying for 2 weeks in total blackness, and we didn't have any fancy approach lights, nothing. They were just short gravel runways, literally in the middle of nowhere. And the only approach facility we mainly had was called NDB approaches. These are non-precision approaches using the ADF in the airplane. Now, Cambridge Bay and Hall Beach had VOR DME approaches, uh, which was so much better. And there was more accuracy involved in those. And in flying up in the Arctic, of course, you can't use magnetic compasses. So each pilot had an astral compass, and we used to take moon shots and star shots, and we independently would work all this out and then come up with an answer and reset the directional gyros. And so that was routinely done, particularly sometimes before an approach, especially in the places like Cape Dyer, which is all mountains. And you go down sort of a valley, and even that, it doesn't line you up with the runway. You literally get, when you cloud break, you're perpendicular to it, and you had to circle over a fjord. Uh, Man, that was really interesting flying, to say the least. So I did that for a number of years, and then I ended up on the 737. Nordair did have a fair size 737 fleet. They had some 737s that flew combi, cargo and passengers, and they were also modified to be able to operate off gravel runways. And Nordair had implemented this really great design and engineered uh, and modified the airplane to protect it against gravel damage. For example, the engines on the 737 are relatively low to the close to the ground, so there was a risk of the engine sucking gravel in. Uh, Very typical in front of a jet engine, there's a vortex that's created. It's like a tornado, and it sucks things into the engine. As a matter of fact, if you look at low hung jet engines and they taxi on an apron area over water, uh, there are times you can actually see this vortex being generated and actually sucking the water into the engine, which of course has no consequence. But gravel is a very different story. So they came up with a very clever idea. Uh, in front of the air intake, just below the engine, is a boom with two sort of jet orifices here. and it would take bleed air and blast it down and more or less destroy that vortex. So the engine couldn't suck the gravel up, or at least mitigate the risk of preventing that from happening. There were special takeoff procedures that you had to use to help prevent that from happening as well. The other risk was the nose wheel would deflect gravel, a spray pattern, and the way it worked out, the spray pattern would actually direct the gravel right towards the air intake of the engines, and obviously the consequences would be dramatic. So they invented for no better word, it's a ski uh, that deflects any debris or gravel that the nose wheel is throwing up and prevents any of that kind of stuff flying towards the engines. It was very effective, worked really well. It was quite a complex piece of engineering with hydraulics and springs because the landing gear still had to retract. So the nose wheel will actually end up in a sort of like a wheel well, and the ski, which was as big as this table here, would have to be stowed. And so anyways, you could see that in some of the pictures that I attached to this video. So that was very interesting flying. Anyways, I did all this training on the 737, and I was finally looking forward to flying, to Florida or the Caribbean or other places in North America. And where was my first trip? Resolute Bay, right up in the high Arctic, landing on a gravel runway. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't get out of the Arctic. So, I flew it, the 737, up to places like Frobisher Bay, which now is called Iqaluit. I flew it into Hall Beach and Cambridge, all gravel operations and, of course, Arctic operations. All very interesting, great experience. Eventually, as my sonority got better, I was able to fly, down south. So that was nice. Now, the industry back then was starting to change. There was an airline called Canadian Pacific Airlines. They bought Nordair. Then there was another company called Pacific Western Airlines, and they bought what was Seapier and Nordair. And that eventually started to really grow. They ended up with Eastern Provincial Airlines and eventually even Wardair. So basically, all the regional carriers all became under one umbrella, which then was renamed as Canadian Airlines. Uh, so throughout that whole time, we just all kept flying. The color of the airplanes were changing. And then under Canadian Airlines, I became an instructor for the 737 and then a check pilot. Eventually at Canadian, then I became the fleet chief pilot for the 37. Was really a very interesting part of my career. Worked with a lot of great people my entire career. It was really a wonderful experience. Interesting times because we had all these different airlines all merged together under Canadian. For example, they all had 737 and they generally all operated them the same, but there were differences on how they operated, slight differences, and there were cultural differences. Um, so that brought on challenges because we wanted to make sure the crews could work seamlessly together. So over time, they developed standard operating procedures. So all the pilots embraced this, and we all basically learned to use the same procedures and same calls in the flight deck, which then uh, the result was you could take an ex-PWA pilot and an ex-Nordair pilot, put them in the flight deck, and they knew what to expect from each other because of the standard operating procedure, the same uh, calls, the same procedures, which enhanced the safety and made it so much easier for the pilots to work together. And that ended up becoming very successful and is today, of course, the industry standard that's used all throughout the world. Uh, the other challenge that we had back in those days, too, was because of all these different airlines, there were different cultures. Uh, so what was evolving at the time was what they call crew resource management, which opened up a whole new spectrum of everything from communications and interaction between people. And so the pilots received crew resource management training, and so did the flight attendants. And we actually used to have joint sessions. I ended up being involved as a developer and a facilitator at the time of that, and we provided all that training. And again, that just helped enhance operationally more of a seamless effect between crews. And that is an industry standard today to employ CRM uh, environment amongst airline crews. And so I did that. And then eventually, so you had Canadian Airlines and Air Canada, which were the two big national carriers. They eventually ended up merging, and it became all under the Air Canada flag, and which made for a very big airline because Canadian Airlines, they had 747s, DC-10s, wide body Airbus, narrow body Airbus, and then Air Canada had a huge fleet. So it ended up a rather large airline. And so when it all came under Air Canada, I continued as the fleet chief pilot for the Boeing 737. And then eventually, um, as they kind of phased that airplane out, I went on the Airbus, the narrow bodies, which was like the 319 and 320 and 21. Then I eventually went back to the Boeing. I went on the wide body, the Boeing 767, and that. And also during that time, then I went over as fleet chief pilot of flight technical. Again, that was really an interesting period in my career because that involved a lot of different elements of flight operations. So I had dispatch and flight planning and airspace and advanced technology, regulatory issues. It was a wide spectrum, involved a lot of talented people. Um, so those were really interesting times. And then eventually I just stayed on the 767 and flew that, I think, close to 10 years. Just flew down the line all over South America, North America, all over Europe. Really, really enjoyed that. A great experience. And then eventually I retired, and that didn't last 6 months. And I ended up working for a company called CAE. They build all the simulators that the airlines use throughout the world, uh, either for their own, their own in-house training. And CAE also provided training for air carriers that wanted to use their service. So out of Toronto, I ended up as their lead Boeing instructor, and so we had a whole department and a team of instructors that taught on the Boeing 737. So we had different customers, and we would train their crews. So I did that, I think, for close to 5 years. Again, throughout my entire career, I've worked just with wonderful people, of great experience, and so then I think I retired. And throughout that entire career, I was involved in radio control models, or U control, you name it. And so I was always in and out of it. I mean, sometimes career wise was demanding, so it was sometimes a little hard to get the time to do as much modeling as I wanted. But I for the most part, stayed active in it. And now, of course, as you know, in my channel, I'm in it rather uh, full time again. And also, from a general aviation perspective, I owned quite a few airplanes. My son flies as well; he flies professionally. Um, so, I when I was young, I ended up with a Piper Pacer, which is a PA-20. That is a small tail dragger. I flew that quite a bit actually, and close to 400 hours in a year or a year and a half, whatever. But I flew it a lot. And then I bought an Apache. I didn't have that very long. And from there, I bought a 172. Actually, I ended up with three different 172s throughout the years. My son, of course, he flew that as well. And then I ended up buying a Boeing Stearman. And well, what I thought was going to be a short-lived, fixer-upper, ended up I don't know. I think I spent around 5 years doing a restoration on that whole airplane. Uh, I was surrounded by some very talented people. So at the end of the day, the airplane ended up just gorgeous. So my son and I flew the Stearman, and then eventually we also bought a turbo twin Comanche, which my son mostly flew. And then, of course, what ended up happening, he's professionally flying. He was flying for an airline, and I was busy flying. Uh, so we just didn't have the time to fly these airplanes as much as we really wanted to. So we ended up selling them. And so that's the general aviation side of things. And I've flown close to 50 different airplanes throughout my flying career, and some of them only for a few hours, and some for a lot. Anyways, I thought I would share that for those that might be interested. Leave me your comments if this is even worthwhile. What I was planning is once in a while to field the questions and comments that I get, and just answer them on a video presentation for those that might be interested. And I'm willing to field just about any kind of question. I do the best I can to answer it. Uh, I've had my share of experiences, whether they were emergencies or just funny events. Um, so I thought I would expand Rick's RC Flying channel just a little bit into the full scale flying. Of course, my real passion now that I'm, being retired is, of course, all this modeling stuff. And anyways, if you like the video, please select like or subscribe. And if you have any comments, by all means, I welcome them. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.